Thanks, man. Good job. Good job. If you have your Bible or your phone, I want you to go to Galatians 5. And while you're turning there, I want to tell you about something fun, at least I think it's going to be fun, that we're going to do in a couple of weeks. If you've been coming for a while, you know that periodically David and I like to do these tag team sermons where he preaches a little while, then I preach a little while, then I come back and, back and forth kind of thing. Not next Sunday, but the Sunday after, February 23rd, we're going to do our first ever triple team sermon. It'll be David, me, and Austin. And to be honest, I have no idea how it's going to go. So if it goes off the rails, I told him in the first service, we're just going to have Rock come up and sing again. So don't worry. It's either going to be awesome or Rock's going to come up and sing, one of the two. So just keep that in mind. Also, next Sunday at 10 o'clock, we're starting our First Steps class down in 1831. We've got a huge sign up for that. So if you're interested in learning more about the church, this would be a great opportunity for you. Just fill this out and take it to Connection Point when the service is over. So as we jump in today, I want you to do me a favor. I want you to think of 4 or 5 places that you never voluntarily go. Now, you can't avoid them completely, but places that if you had your pick, you would never go if you could help it. I was thinking about this some this week, and the only rule is you can't put church on that list, okay? Because that would make things a little bit awkward for the remaining time we have together. But other than that, it's your choice. So I was thinking about this. I made my own list, and if you know me, the number one thing on my list would be the dentist office. I've had the same dentist since I was 2 years old, and he's kind of like a member of the family, except I like him, but I don't like going to his office. I walk in there, and I see those tools, and I hear that drill, and it's like my blood pressure just skyrockets. So that'd be number one. Number 2 for me would be the drive-in movie. Now, I know some of you really enjoy that. The last time I went, about 120 degrees, the mosquitoes were out, and the movie never came on. Waited for 2 hours, so that kind of did me in. Third place would be Hobby Lobby. Now, I know a lot of you really enjoy that. Spend a lot of money there, but that's just not my thing. I'll just wait in the car. And then the fourth place would be a place that's very similar, Bath and Body Works. It's a place that sells all the soaps and lotions. I go in there, I'm not kidding you. Within 30 seconds, my eyes are watering, I'm sneezing. It becomes sort of a whole big deal for the people around me. So as a public service, I try not to go. And you've got places like that too that, you may not avoid them completely, but there's just places that you'd rather not go if you didn't have to. If you think about it long enough, though, there's another place that you probably would avoid going if at all possible, and that's prison. If you ever visited a prison, if you ever been incarcerated, then you know that's not a place that you would ever voluntarily go. Instead, it's a place that you try to avoid if at all possible. But did you know that there are certain people that actually volunteer to go to prison? Back in 2016, there was a show on the network A&E titled 60 Days In. It's still on. You can watch it different seasons, but started in 2016. The way it worked, they took 7 innocent people and they put them in the Clark County Jail in Jeffersonville, Indiana for 60 days. And during that time period, they had these hidden cameras all over the jail, all over the facility that filmed everything that went on, every conversation, every interaction. The sheriff of the county explained it saying, it's part, reality TV show, but it's also part investigation. At that time in the jail, they were having all sorts of problems with drug smuggling and gang violence. And the idea was we'll film these 7 people. When this is over, we'll bring them in. We'll talk to them about maybe some ways that we can solve these problems in the future. Now, knowing all of that, you would think that it would be difficult to find 7 people willing to go to jail for 60 days in that kind of environment. And as the show started, one of the things the producers were worried about is whether or not they'd even be able to find enough people to have this show. But then the strangest thing happened. When they put out the word of what they were doing, they had hundreds and hundreds of people go to their website and fill out these online applications to be one of these 7 people. In fact, they had so many people apply to be on the show that the website crashed. One of the producers said this. He said, the most surprising thing of the whole experience was how many folks were willing to put aside their lives for 2 months to participate in a program like this. Soccer moms, school teachers, college students, grandparents, law enforcement officers, business executives, even a daycare worker. In other words, there were people just like you, just like me. They had homes, they had families, they had jobs, they had hobbies, they had friends that they liked to hang out with. And all of that leads to the question, why would anybody volunteer to go to jail? Galatians 5, the Apostle Paul asked that same question. If you've been with us, we've been working our way through this letter. The years earlier, before he wrote this letter, Paul had been in the region of Galatia preaching, starting churches, and then as soon as he left, these false teachers known as the Judaizers showed up, and they began to tell the people, hey, it's fine if you want to trust in Jesus, but in order to really be accepted by God, you also have to follow all of the Jewish rules. So in other words, they were saying, hey, fine if you want to be a Christian, but in order to be a Christian, you first have to become a Jew. So Paul hears what's happening. He writes this letter to correct some things, to sort of clear the air, and reminds the people of the truth that he had previously taught them in person. So in the first half of the letter, he goes through and he re-explains the gospel. He says, here's what you need to believe. Then you get to the second half of this letter, and he focuses on how you and I are supposed to live as people who have been rescued. So as Galatians 5 opens, he reminds them again of this freedom that they should be experiencing. And as you read through his words, you can almost hear him in the background questioning, hey, after everything you've learned, after everything you've experienced, after everything we've been through together, why in the world would you ever volunteer to go back to where you started? Why would you volunteer after you've tasted freedom to go back to prison? Galatians chapter 5, verse 1 is the key verse of the entire letter. Here's what he says. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. Now, if there's one verse in the entire letter that you need to memorize, it's this one. Paul understood that for followers of Jesus, there would always be this intense temptation to give up the freedom that Christ had given you and go back to prison. And whenever a person is formally sentenced to serve time in prison, their name and their information are entered into this system that's controlled by the Bureau of Prisons. And at that point, there's somebody who takes all the information, they look at all the options, and they make a decision as to which prison is best for that person to serve their time in. Well, as you read through the book of Galatians, Paul mentions over and over again, there are two different prisons that you and I sometimes find ourselves in. They're both equally dangerous, but they're also equally attractive for different reasons. The first prison that he's talked a lot about is this prison of legalism. Now, if you grew up in church, that may be the one that you struggle with. The idea in this one is that as long as you work hard enough and you follow the rules closely enough, God will see your efforts. He'll accept you because of how hard you worked, and eventually He'll adopt you into His family. At the most basic level, the idea in this prison is hard work leads to freedom. Good behavior leads to freedom. The problem with that is that in spite of your efforts, your Herculean efforts to be perfect, you keep messing it up. You keep running into your own imperfection. And so what happens? You spend all of your life living in this prison, trying to earn something you can never earn, feeling like you never measure up because the truth is that you don't. The other prison that Paul talks about is the prison of sin. Just like today in the first century, there are people who heard the message of the gospel and they decided since there was nothing they could do to earn their salvation, they would just do whatever they wanted. So instead of worrying about following the rules, they poured all their energy into having a good time, and it sort of became anything goes, and the idea was that pleasure leads to freedom. Some of you here this morning have been in that prison, and no matter how hard you've tried, you keep finding yourself going back, you keep falling into old habits, old addictions, old ways of thinking, and you feel like you're never going to escape. And according to Paul, the gospel sets us free from both of those prisons. It frees us from having to earn our way while at the same time freeing us from having to spend our lives as slaves to our own sinful desires. But then, in maybe the most chilling part of the whole letter, Paul talks about this intense temptation that all of us feel to voluntarily re-enter one of those two prisons. Listen how he says this again. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. In other words, when Jesus came, He came so that we could live in freedom. That means we don't have to live as an inmate in either one of these prisons, the prison of legalism or the prison of sin. But then look at that next part. He says, stand firm then and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. What's he saying? He's saying that once you've been set free, whatever you do, whatever happens to you, don't go back. Don't allow yourself to be reincarcerated in a prison that you've already been set free from. So if you're following along on your outline, here's the command straight from the pen of Paul. It's this. He says to stand firm. Now, in Greek, that's a military term that means to refuse to retreat. And the image is, here's this soldier, and he's standing up, and he sees this enemy approaching. He knows he's about to be overpowered, but instead of going backwards, he maintains his ground. He stands firm. And the idea is that requires a certain amount of diligence, a certain amount of persistence. In order to stand firm, you've got to keep your guard up. So how do you do that? Well, Paul, as you go through this passage, gives us some examples. How do you stand firm when the temptation to go back is always so strong? You read this passage, he gives us 3 ideas. You put those things together, he gives us a pretty good plan for standing firm. So here's the first one. If you're going to stand firm, you have to consistently choose grace over legalism. You choose grace over legalism. Look at what he says in verse 2. Mark my words, I, Paul, tell you that if you let yourselves be circumcised, Christ will be of no value to you at all. Again, I declare to every man who lets himself be circumcised that he is obligated to obey the whole law. You who are trying to be justified by the law have been alienated from Christ. You have fallen away from grace. For through the Spirit we eagerly await by faith the righteousness for which we hope. So you go through this and it sounds kind of repetitive because he keeps coming back to the same thing, but you have to remember he's writing this to real people, real situation. They're facing real pressure from these false teachers to be circumcised. And the reason that was so important is because circumcision was the physical mark that you are now a member of the chosen people of God. So that was sort of the starting point. So they told the people, hey, if you get circumcised, you're now one of us and we'll figure out the rest of it later. But Paul hears what's happening. He understands what's happening, so he encourages them, hey, hit the brakes, stop and think about what you're doing, and decide for yourself, which path am I going to follow? And just so there's no ambiguity, he tells them, hey, if you choose to go that route, if you choose to follow that path, then just be assured that it's all going to be on you. Because at that point, what Jesus did for you is not going to count anymore. It's all going to be on your efforts. Now, throughout the first part of the book, over and over again, Paul says the gospel message is that Jesus plus nothing equals salvation. But then you come to this part, and the Judaizers show up and they say, it's not just Jesus plus nothing. It's Jesus plus circumcision plus following the law equals salvation. And Paul says, once you change that equation, you lose Jesus. It can't be Jesus plus anything because those two things cannot coexist. It's either Jesus and what Jesus did for you, or it's the law and what you try to do for yourself. It can't be both. That's why in verse 4 he says, if you decide to trust in the law, or you decide to follow the path of legalism, that you are alienated from Christ and you've fallen away from grace. Now, this is one of those verses in the Bible. A lot of people do a lot of mental gymnastics. They try to make this say something that it doesn't say. My opinion, and when you read the Bible, the way to read it is this. It means exactly what it says. And it means that if you decide at some point in your spiritual journey to stop trusting in Christ and to start trusting in something else besides Christ, then you're alienating yourself from Christ and you've fallen away from grace. That's why Paul says you have to stand firm in your commitment to grace over legalism. So you might think about it like this. I want you to imagine that somebody came up to me after the service and they said, Joe, I really enjoyed the message a couple weeks ago. It was really helpful. And I wanted to do something for you, so they hand me an envelope, and inside that envelope is a $100 gift card to my favorite restaurant. Now, I'm not going to tell you what it is because I don't want you to do this. I did tell the first service people, just in case. But they bring this up, and I pull this out, and here's the envelope. Here's the gift card. And I said, well, that's really nice. I noticed it's for $100, so I say to the person, hey, that's a lot of money, and you don't really need to do that. How about I split this with you? How about I give you $75, and that way you've done something for me, but you're not going overboard. And they think about that a second and say, no, I'm not going to do that. Okay, all right, how about $50? I'll give you $50, and then it's sort of even, Stephen, and I'll enjoy this, and you'll feel good. No, I'm not going to do that. Okay, how about $25? Well, that got their attention. And you sort of see the wheels turning, and they say, okay, $25 is great. So I pull out my wallet, and I hand them $25, and they hand me the $100 gift card, and we both feel pretty good, right? I'm getting a good deal. They feel like they've done okay. But here's the point. The moment they take my $25, it's not a gift card anymore. It's a discount card. And a discount card is different than a gift card. And when it comes to salvation, when it comes to grace, God doesn't give you a discount. It's not as if he makes up the 75% and now it's up to you to make up the other 25%. No, he pays the 100% of the sin debt that you owe. The only thing he asks is that you accept that and take it for what it is. You take it as a gift. But the moment you try to pay for it yourself, you forfeit the gift because you can't have it both ways. So in order to stand firm and avoid going back to captivity, you have to choose grace over legalism. Now here's the second thing. You choose love over ceremony. Now if you ever took a college class, you know the first day of class, the professor comes in, they hand out this document that's called the syllabus, and they go through, and here's what's expected of you, here's what you can expect over the class, here's what you have to do. Then they give you the grading scale, and here's what you have to do to get an A, and here's what it takes to get a B, and on down the line. And you sort of know how that goes. But at the end of that, when you walk out of that, you should know what to expect. And the syllabus really answers the question, what counts? I mean, there's going to be a lot that happens over the course of a semester, but what is it that I really need to pay attention to? When you get to verse 6 of Galatians 5, Paul answers that question. He answers the question, what counts? But what I want you to notice is he answers it in a way that would have surprised his first century audience and still surprises most of us. Look at what he says, Galatians 5, verse 6. For in Christ Jesus, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision has any value. Now check this out. The only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. Now keep in mind, circumcision was an external thing. It was a ceremonial thing. And really, by that point in history, the Jewish religion had evolved to the point where it was mostly focused on external things like, what you wore and who you hung out with, who you had contact with, what you ate, how far you walked on certain days. And the problem with all of those external things is that none of them had the power to transform a person's internal world. In other words, they could help you look and act a certain way, but they couldn't transform your heart. And I don't know what it is, but throughout history, there's always been this dangerous tendency to reduce following Jesus down to nothing more than this long list of external things that we think we're supposed to do in order to please God. So if we went around the room and you gave me your list and I gave you my list, there'd probably be a lot of overlap. Because depending on how you grew up, we're all working from different versions of the same list. So you look at your list, it probably says things like, hey, I've got to go to church 3 times a month in order to be pleasing to God. And when I go to church, I've got to sing the songs, and even if I don't like them, and when I'm there, I have to dress up because dressing up communicates that I'm honoring God. And when the offering plate's passed, I've got to throw in a little money, and I've got to serve a couple months a year in the kids' ministry, and I've got to be ready for special events to serve. And we've all got our list of things, and you keep adding to the list, and eventually you've got this list of half a dozen things that make you think, if I just do these things, then I'll be pleasing to God. But here's the thing, you look at your list, and I look at my list, and it's a safe bet that 90% of the things on your list are all external things. They're all ceremonial things. And I don't know why it is, but it seems to be the way most of us are wired. We like to use these things that we can see, these things that we can measure as a way of gauging where we are spiritually. The problem is you go through your list, and I go through my list, almost everything on your list could be done by a person whose heart is unchanged. Let me give you an example. Do you think it's possible to have nearly perfect attendance at church and go home every night and ignore your family? Think it's possible? How about this? Is it possible that when you're at church to sing every word to every song and really, get into it, and then do that on Sunday, and then you go to work on Monday and cuss everybody out and spend all your day tearing your coworkers down? Is it possible to wear a 3-piece suit to church on a Sunday and wear your Sunday best and still have a heart that's selfish and unrepentant? Do you think it's possible that you could take the Lord's Supper with your brothers and sisters in Christ and then go home and spend all of your time tearing down people on social media because they disagree with you? I think that's possible. How about this one? Do you think it's possible to give money during the offering time and then spend the rest of your week with a heart that's controlled by greed and anger? Is it possible to teach a Bible study on loving your neighbor and then go to a restaurant and act like a complete idiot when the food doesn't come out as quick as you think it should? You think that's possible? Is it possible that you could do any of those things and have a heart that's unchanged? I think it is. And you know why I think that? Because I've done it. And you have too. Paul says it's not the external things. It's not the ceremonial things that count. In fact, he takes it even further than many of us are comfortable with. And he says the only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. So what is it that counts? Well, according to Paul, it's how you love the people around you. It's how you serve the people around you. What is it that motivates that love? It's our faith. But Paul uses a word there that makes a lot of us uncomfortable, and it's that word only. See, if Paul had said, one of the things that counts, one of the many things that counts is how you love the people around you, we'd say, okay, that's awesome. I can get down with that. But when he says it's the only thing that counts, that makes us pause and catch our breath. See, Paul said, of all the things that could count, the only thing that does count is your faith expressing itself through love. Now you hear that and you got some questions, and it's understandable. You might be thinking to yourself, okay, but what about my successes? What about all the times that I did really well and I got it right? Do those count? And the answer is no, those don't count. All right, what about all my failures? What about times I blew it and I tried really hard and I came up short? Do those count? And the answer is no, those don't count either. I love the way Tim Keller put this. Here's what he said. He said, my good performance does not make me right with God. Because to be honest, your good performance isn't that good. Nor does my bad performance really make me any more lost and hopeless. All stand equally lost and equally able to be saved. The truth is that all of us are in the same boat when it comes to what counts and what doesn't count. And what counts is how we love people. What doesn't count is how good or bad I do. In the book of James, the half-brother of Jesus said it this way. He said, in the same way, faith by itself, if it's not accompanied by action, is dead. So James says, hey, if you've put your faith in Christ and that faith is real, that should be what energizes you to love the people around you. When you read the New Testament, you discover that it was that kind of faith that those early followers of Jesus had. It was infinitely more focused on loving God and loving the people around them than it was going through a checklist of religious do's and religious don'ts. So with that in mind, there's a question that you need to learn to ask in every situation, every relationship, every environment in which you find yourself. You should be asking this question: what's the most loving thing to do? Every relationship, every conversation, everywhere you go, what's the most loving thing to do? And then as you ask that question, and then you do whatever it is that love requires, you'll discover that your faith is becoming more and more real. And that's what counts. So whatever you do as you go through your day-to-day life, make sure that you're choosing love over ceremony. Last thing, you choose truth over confusion. Check out what he says in verse 7. You were running a good race. Who cut in on you to keep you from obeying the truth? That kind of persuasion does not come from the one who calls you. A little yeast works through the whole batch of dough. I'm confident in the Lord that you will take no other view. The one who is throwing you into confusion, whoever that may be, will have to pay the penalty. Now listen to this part. Brothers and sisters, if I am still preaching circumcision, why am I still being persecuted? In that case, the offense of the cross has been abolished. As for those agitators, I wish they would go the whole way and emasculate themselves. That's kind of the rated R part of the book of Galatians. You read that and you think, I can't believe that's in the Bible. But the reason that's in the Bible is Paul wants to be clear that this is not a matter of opinion. There's no room for ambiguity. This is not something, well, if I get this right and get it wrong, it's okay. No, this is something that you have to get right. And to make it even more dramatic, remember this, Paul is writing to people who made a good start. Verse 7, he says, who cut in on you? You were going the right direction. It's another one of those military terms that describes what would happen when an invading army would come in. They tear up the roads so that nobody could escape. So the image is here, this group of folks, they're moving in the right direction, they're moving forward, and they come to this certain point, and the road's torn up, and they're not sure what to do, so what do? They turn back. And that's what these false teachers were doing. They were sowing confusion among the people so that hopefully they would stop and eventually they'd be tempted to turn back. So if you look this closely, Paul tells you 3 things about false teaching you have to be aware of. First, he says, it doesn't come from God. So that kind of persuasion does not come from the one who calls you. What's that mean? It means if you hear teaching that sounds more like legalism than it does the gospel, you need to stay away from it. If you catch yourself focusing more on externals than you do the condition of your heart and how you love the people around you, then you know that doesn't come from God. Second thing he says is that false teaching always spreads. He uses the example of yeast in a batch of dough. If you ever made any bread, it doesn't take a very small amount of yeast to work its way through that dough. And that's the way false teaching works. It spreads. That's why one of the main responsibilities of an elder is to make sure the church is protected from false teaching. One writer said it like this: it only takes a small dose of the wrong thing to ruin the whole thing. And that's the truth. Here's the last thing. He says it leads to a penalty. He said the one throwing you into confusion will have to pay the penalty. So why was Paul so fired up about this? Why does he use an image that would be rated R in most movies? I think it was two things. First, it's obvious. You read through everything he wrote. Paul had a passion for the truth. He wanted to know the truth. He wanted to be on God's side in every argument. That's why he asked questions of himself. It's why he confronted the other apostles. It's why he took on these false teachers. He wanted to be on God's side in every issue. But the other reason I think he's so keyed up about this is if you know his story, then you know that for most of his life, Paul lived as a Pharisee. I mean, he was one of the religious elites. Went to the best schools, educated by the best teachers, worked himself to death trying to follow the law and earn his way into a relationship with God. But the problem was, no matter how hard he worked, no matter how hard he tried, he could never measure up. And the truth is, until the moment he believed in the gospel, Paul lived most of his life in a prison that he couldn't escape. And once he did escape, he didn't want anybody else to have to suffer what he suffered through. He didn't want anybody to live in prison. Why would anybody volunteer to live in a prison? I have a picture that I want to show you. This is Zach. He's originally from Knoxville, Tennessee. He was a participant on the first season of 60 Days In. Before that, he was in the Marine Corps, served 2 tours of duty, saw action in Afghanistan and in Iraq. With his background in the military, the producers thought, well, he can obviously handle himself. The high-stress environment won't bother him too much, and perfect candidate for the show. And for the most part, that proved true. One of the unexpected things that happened during that 60-day stay, though, in the Clark County, Indiana jail was he developed a close friendship with 2 other guys. Both were veterans. Both had come back from overseas and fallen into some drug problems, and both wound up incarcerated. But through different scenes throughout the season, they would show these 3 guys talking and this friendship that was developing. The other thing they highlighted during that first season, though, was just how much Zach began to miss his wife and his newborn son. Just 3 months before he volunteered to go into jail for 2 months, his wife gave birth to a son. And even though he was undercover in the jail, one of the first things he did is he hung this picture of his wife and his son in his cell. And then every night they had this real dramatic scene where they zoomed the camera in, and he'd be sitting there staring at this picture, and you could tell that he was missing his family. At the end of the first season, there's this cool scene where Zach is released after serving his 60 days, and he debriefs with the authorities. And then there's this scene where he's reunited with his wife and his son. He takes his son in his arms, and he's holding, everybody's crying. It's kind of this dramatic, emotional scene. And at that point, the story ends, at least as far as the show is concerned. You just assume that everybody goes on to live happily ever after. But I want you to imagine that after he'd been home for a few weeks, Zach starts to miss his buddies in jail. And he starts to sort of miss the environment and starts to think, well, maybe it wasn't that bad. Maybe I should just go back. So he calls up the producers and he says, hey, could you get me back in? Oh, and this time I don't want to stay just 60 days. I want to stay 120 days. Is there any way that you could help me get back into jail? Now how do you think that conversation would go? assuming the producers didn't hang up on him, you'd assume they would just take the call and they'd spend the next few minutes explaining to him how freedom is much better than prison. I mean, the food's better, the beds are more comfortable, the environment's more forgiving. You can come and go as you want to. You kind of make your own schedule. You're not at the mercy of anybody else, and you get to hang out with your family. You get to hold your son instead of just looking at a picture of him. I mean, you would think that would be an easy sell because everybody knows that freedom is better than prison. I mean, freedom's always better than prison. So why would anybody volunteer to go back to prison? And the answer is nobody in their right mind would, except we all do. We all do. Some of you here this morning have done that. At one point in your life, you were free, man. You were experiencing the joy of living as somebody who'd been rescued. But then something happened. You got distracted. You got discouraged. You didn't stand quite as firm as you should have. And before you even knew what happened, you found yourself right back inside those prison walls. You may have never been inside a physical prison, but when we talk about that prison of legalism or that prison of sin, you know what it is because you've lived there. And no matter how hard you try, you can't seem to break free. What do you do if you find yourself in prison? Paul said it like this: it's for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. I want you to stand. If you're here this morning and you know that you need to be set free, you need to be rescued, I can't rescue you, and you can't rescue yourself. But Jesus can rescue you, and not only can He wants to do that. So if you're here and you want to pray with somebody, you want somebody to help you navigate what it looks like to escape from prison and live a life of freedom, David Phillips and I will be here. You just come down front here. We'll meet with you. We'll be glad to pray with you, be glad to talk with you, get you any help that you need. Others of you may be here, and you may decide that today is the day that you want to join the family. At First Christian, we had a lady do that first service, so we've been coming a while, and maybe today's the day you feel the Holy Spirit calling you to do that. But whatever you need to do, you want to pray with somebody, you want to talk to somebody, you want to join the team, you just meet us on this front row.